The color of my own invisibility was a pale, washed-out gray, the shade of forgotten things. It was the color of the dress my stepmother, Beatrice, had chosen for me, the color of the wall I was meant to blend into. "You are a creature of the shadows, Elara," she had said, her voice a silken thread laced with arsenic. "It is best you learn to embrace them. Stand by the pillar near the ferns. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not move. Become architecture." And so I had. For 3 hours I had been a silent caryatid, supporting nothing, witnessing everything. My sister, Rosalind, was a sunburst in the center of the ballroom. Her gown was the color of fresh cream, shimmering with 1,000 tiny seed pearls. Her laughter was a melody that drew people to her like moths to a flame my stepmother carefully tended. My father, a man long since hollowed out by grief and acquiescence, stood beside Beatrice, his smile a fragile painted thing. He saw me, I knew he did. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or shame, crossed his face before he turned back to the glittering assembly, leaving me to my stony silence. I was the family's inconvenient truth, the quiet, plain daughter from his first marriage, a living relic of a love he had been forced to forget. The room was a masterpiece of Palladian design, a symphony of balance and proportion that no one else seemed to notice. They saw the gilding, the crystal, the sheer expense of it all. I saw the exquisite coffered ceiling, the precise rhythm of the Corinthian pilasters, the way the light from the chandeliers was designed to fall in pools, creating islands of intimacy in the vast space. This was my secret language, my silent rebellion. While they chattered about dowries and dukedoms, I was deconstructing the room, tracing its lines, understanding its soul. It was a comfort, this world of stone and order. It could not lie or wound or dismiss. It simply was. Then the whispers began, the whispers. A current of energy, sharp and sudden, cut through the warm, wine-soaked air. The music seemed to falter. Laughter died in throats. Even Rosalind, the epicenter of the room's social gravity, turned toward the grand entrance. He had arrived. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair. A name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. He was a creature of myth as much as man, owner of half the county, possessor of a fortune that defied imagination, and a recluse of the highest order. He was said to be cold, severe, a man carved from the same granite as his ancestral home. He had not attended a ball in 5 years, not since the tragedy that had claimed his younger brother. His presence here was an event, a disruption of the natural order that sent a tremor of shock and frantic calculation through every ambitious mother in the room. Beatrice's hand tightened on my father's arm, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Rosalind was perfectly positioned, a beautiful blooming flower waiting to be plucked. This, Beatrice's expression screamed, was the moment she had engineered our entire lives for. The Duke moved through the parted crowd, a dark, immovable object in a sea of pastel silks. He was taller than I had imagined, his shoulders broad, his face a collection of harsh, handsome lines that gave nothing away. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, swept the room with an unnerving stillness, cataloging, assessing, dismissing. They passed over the bowing lords and curtsying ladies. They passed over the hopeful, simpering debutantes. They passed over Rosalind's brilliant, practiced smile. For a moment, a flicker of disappointment crossed Beatrice's face, and then his eyes found me. They did not slide past. They did not dismiss. They stopped. He looked at me, standing in my gray shroud by the pillar in the ferns, and it was as if the noise of the entire world fell away. There was no pity in his gaze, no curiosity, no amusement. There was only recognition. It was a terrifying, impossible sensation, like being struck by lightning in a windowless room. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a blush of pure, mortified shock. I wanted to shrink, to physically dissolve into the marble behind me. He ignored the host, who was sputtering a welcome. He ignored the dozen introductions being attempted. He began to walk, his path a straight, unwavering line directly toward my corner of the room. 100 pairs of eyes followed him, their collective gaze a physical weight that pressed down on me. I could feel Beatrice's fury burning a hole in my back. This was not part of her design. I was not part of any design. He stopped a few feet from me. The scent of winter air and old books clung to him. Close up, the severity of his features was even more pronounced. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that only made him seem more formidable. He did not smile. He simply looked at me, and then his gaze lifted, following mine to the coffered ceiling. "Scamozzi," he said. His voice was a low rumble, quiet but carrying in the sudden absolute silence. "A student of Palladio. Most people mistake this ceiling for English Baroque. They miss the precision of the geometry, the mathematical harmony. You did not." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. How could he know? How could he possibly see into the secret, silent world I inhabited? I had written a paper, years ago, for a forgotten academic journal, a treatise on the influence of Venetian architects on English country houses. A foolish, passionate thing I had never imagined anyone of consequence would read. I could not find my voice. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. "I thought as much," he said. He gave a slight formal bow. "Your Grace," he murmured, a title that sounded absurd when directed at me. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me in the wreckage of the silence, no longer invisible, but pinned by the spotlight of 1,000 bewildered stares. The rest of the evening was a blur of whispered questions and the venomous glare of my stepmother. I had broken her cardinal rule. I had not been architecture. I had been seen. The summons arrived the next morning, a single sheet of heavy cream parchment bearing the stark, black wax seal of the Duke of Blackwood. It was not an invitation. It was a command. I was to present myself at Blackwood Manor that afternoon. Beatrice was incandescent with a rage that was terrifying to behold. "What did you do?" she hissed, snatching the letter from my trembling hands. "What trick did you play, you sly little creature? He is meant for Rosalind. This is all for Rosalind." "I did nothing," I whispered, which was the truth. "He spoke to me, that is all." "He does not just speak to anyone," she spat. "He is toying with you. It is a game, a cruel joke to humiliate us. You will go and you will be meek and dull, and you will extinguish whatever momentary flicker of interest he has. You will speak of nothing but needlepoint and the weather. Do you understand me, Elara?" I understood. I was to perform the part I had been assigned my whole life, the uninteresting, vapid girl. I was to prove that his assessment of me had been a mistake. The thought was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. For one brief, impossible moment, I had felt seen for who I was. Now I was being ordered to erase myself once more. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a geological feature. It rose from the misty landscape like a cliff face of gray granite, severe and imposing, beautiful in its stark lack of ornamentation. It was a building that had no need for fripperies. Its power was in its form, its history, its sheer permanence. My heart, which had been aflutter with anxiety, settled into a quiet hum of reverence. This place spoke my language. I was shown not to a drawing room or a parlor, but to the library. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with shelves that soared into the shadows, accessible only by a rolling ladder. The air smelled of leather and paper and beeswax. And there he was, standing by a towering window that overlooked a windswept moor, not in formal attire, but in a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked less like a duke and more like a scholar. He turned as I entered, his gray eyes assessing me. "Lady Elara, thank you for coming." I curtsied, my gray muslin dress feeling drab and childish in the magnificent room. I remembered Beatrice's instructions. "The weather is quite mild for this time of year, Your Grace." The words felt like ash in my mouth. A flicker of something, disappointment, annoyance, crossed his face. He gestured to a large table in the center of the room, which was covered not with tea things, but with architectural drawings and heavy books. "I did not summon you to discuss the weather. I summoned you to discuss Vincenzo Scamozzi." He tapped a page in an open book. It was a copy of the very journal in which my article had been published. My article. He had it. He had sought it out. He had read it. "You argued," he said, his voice losing its formal edge and gaining a low, intense energy, "that Scamozzi's theories on structural integrity were more influential on Wren than Palladio's were. A bold claim. one that most architectural historians would dismiss out of hand. Defend it. Beatrice's commands evaporated like mist in the sun. This was not a social test. It was an intellectual challenge. A fire I thought long extinguished flickered to life inside me. I stepped forward, my fear forgotten, replaced by a fierce, forgotten passion. For the next hour, we did not speak of needlepoint. We spoke of flying buttresses and stress load distribution. We argued about the true purpose of the ha-ha. We debated the aesthetic merits of the Doric versus the Ionic order. It was not a conversation. It was a duet. His mind was as sharp and precise as a draftsman's rule, and for the first time in my life, I felt I had met an equal. When I finally paused, breathless, I realized the sun was setting, painting the room in hues of orange and gold. I had been with him for hours. I had forgotten my place, my fear, my own carefully constructed invisibility. "I apologize, Your Grace," I stammered, heat flooding my face again. "I have been impertinent." "You have been brilliant," he corrected me, his voice soft. For the first time, the severe lines of his face relaxed into something that was almost a smile. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. My brother? He would have enjoyed this conversation. He was the architect. I was merely the historian. He spoke of his brother Julian for the first time. He spoke of a shared passion, of late nights spent poring over blueprints, of a dream they had to restore the crumbling east wing of the manor. He spoke of the accident, a fall from a scaffold, with a grief that was still raw and palpable, a wound that had never truly healed. In that moment, he was not the formidable Duke of Blackwood. He was just Alistair, a man haunted by loss. And I, the girl who had always felt like a ghost in her own home, understood. He sent me home in his own carriage, a quiet act of protection and possession that did not go unnoticed. Beatrice was waiting, her face a mask of cold fury. "You were there for 4 hours, she stated, her voice dangerously calm. "We discussed architecture, stepmother." "Do you take me for a fool?" she sneered. "You are weaving some kind of web, you pathetic little spider. But I will not allow it. The Duke is for Rosalind. I will find a match for you, someone suitable for your station. A country vicar, perhaps. Or a retired merchant with a gouty leg." The threat was real. She would marry me off to the first undesirable man who would have me, just to remove me from the board. A familiar cold dread seeped into my bones. The hope that had begun to bloom in the Duke's library felt fragile, tenuous, easily crushed. Over the next few weeks, a strange, quiet courtship began. He did not send flowers or poems. He sent books. Rare editions of architectural treatises, portfolios of Piranesi's engravings, a slim volume of John Soane's lectures. Each was a message, a continuation of our conversation. We met for chaperoned walks where Rosalind was always pushed forward as the intended object of his attention. But his questions were always for me. He would point to a crumbling folly in the distance and ask me to date it by its stonework. He would describe a room and challenge me to deduce its original purpose from its dimensions. Rosalind, to her credit, was not cruel. She was merely baffled. "He is very serious, is he not?" she whispered to me one afternoon, after the Duke had spent 20 minutes explaining the principles of hydrostatic pressure in relation to fountain design. "And he asks you the strangest questions, Elara. Why does he care what you think about roof trusses?" "I do not know," I lied, guarding the precious secret understanding that was growing between us. During one such walk, he drew me slightly aside. Under the pretense of examining the keystone of an old bridge, our chaperones were a dozen paces away. "She's trying to marry you off," he said, his voice low. It was not a question. I stared at the worn stone, unable to meet his eyes. "She believes it is for the best." "Do you?" I shook my head, a small, miserable gesture. His hand came up, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to touch my face. Instead, his fingers brushed against the cold stone of the bridge, inches from my own. It was a gesture of immense restraint, yet it felt more intimate than any touch. "I will not allow it," he said. The words were a vow, a shield thrown around me. The sheer, unshakable certainty in his voice made me want to weep. For my entire life, no one had ever fought for me. No one had ever stood between me and the quiet, crushing weight of my family's indifference. Beatrice's desperation grew with each book that arrived, each pointed question the Duke directed at me in public. Her plan was unraveling, and the prize she coveted was slipping through her fingers. She escalated her campaign of quiet cruelty. My meager allowance was cut off. My favorite books disappeared from my room. She made cutting remarks in front of the servants, designed to chip away at my confidence, to remind me of my worthlessness. "So plain and yet so ambitious," she would murmur, just loud enough for me to hear. "It is a pitiful combination." But her poison was losing its potency. The Duke's regard was an antidote, a quiet, steady warmth that was beginning to thaw the frozen parts of my heart. I was starting to believe I was not the creature she had made me. I was starting to believe I was the person Alistair saw. The breaking point came in the form of a letter. Not from the Duke, but for him. I saw it on the hall table, waiting for the footman. It was in Beatrice's elegant, cruel handwriting. My blood ran cold. I knew, with an instinct born of years of her manipulations, what it was. It was a weapon, aimed directly at the fragile hope I had allowed myself to nurture. I could not have known the contents then, but I learned them later. It was a masterpiece of vicious insinuation. She painted me as a mentally unstable, conniving creature, obsessed with the Duke to a delusional degree. She wrote of my strange fixations on buildings, framing my passion as a sign of a disordered mind. She claimed I was prone to fits of fancy, that I had concocted our entire intellectual connection. She ended with a plea, dripping with false maternal concern, for him to cease all contact, lest he encourage my unhealthy fantasies and lead me to ruin. It was designed to make him see me as pathetic, pitiable, and perhaps even dangerous. For 2 days there was silence. No books arrived, no messages came from Blackwood Manor. The silence was a suffocating void, and in it all my old fears and insecurities rushed back in. Beatrice was smug, triumphant. She had fired her shot, and she believed it had hit its mark. "I told you it was a game," she said, her voice laced with false sympathy. "Men like the Duke do not dally with gray mice. He has come to his senses. Now, about that vicar in Little Hangleton." I felt myself shrinking again, the walls of my carefully built confidence crumbling to dust. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps it had all been a misunderstanding, a whim on his part. Perhaps I'd imagined the depth of our connection, the look of recognition in his eyes. The color of invisibility began to creep back into my world. On the 3rd day, the Duke's carriage arrived, not for me. For my father, my stepmother, my sister, and myself. We were all summoned to Blackwood Manor, immediately. There was no room for refusal. Beatrice was ecstatic. "You see," she whispered to Rosalind, pinching her cheek, "he means to make an offer. He simply needed to clear the air of that foolishness with Elara. Wear your blue silk, darling. It matches your eyes." The journey was tense and silent, and Beatrice radiated smug victory. My father looked nervous. Rosalind looked confused. I felt nothing but a hollow, aching dread. I was being brought to my own execution, to be formally dismissed and humiliated in front of my family. We were shown into the library. Alistair was standing by the fireplace, his face as hard and unreadable as granite. He did not invite us to sit. He held a letter in his hand. Beatrice's letter. "Lady Ashworth," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "I received your letter concerning your stepdaughter." Beatrice arranged her features into a mask of concern. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry you were troubled. I only wrote out of love for the poor dear girl." "You wrote," he interrupted, his voice cutting like a shard of ice, "a collection of malicious and demonstrable falsehoods. You accuse her of having a disordered mind because of her passion for architecture. A passion, I have found, that is backed by a formidable intellect. You speak of her delusional fantasies. Yet every conversation I have had with her has been lucid, insightful, and brilliant." He took a step forward. "You also seem to be under the impression that you control her future." He glanced at a stack of papers on the table, held down by a heavy paperweight. "My solicitors have been busy these past 2 days. They have been reviewing the trust left to Elara by her late mother, a trust which you, as her guardian, have been systematically plundering for years to fund your own ambitions and pay for your daughter's wardrobe." The color drained from Beatrice's face. My father made a choked sound. "Alistair, your Grace, there must be some mistake." The only mistake, the Duke said, his eyes locking onto Beatrice's, was your assumption that I am a fool, or that I would allow anyone to harm her. He let the letter drop from his fingers. It fluttered into the fire and was instantly consumed. You will repay every last shilling, you will make a public apology, and you will never ever speak to Elara again. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Beatrice stared at him, her mask of civility shattered, revealing the raw, ugly greed and hatred beneath. And then, something inside me broke open. The years of silence, of swallowed pain, of forced invisibility, fell away. I found my voice. He is not the only one you owe an apology to, I said, my voice shaking but clear. All eyes turned to me. I looked directly at the woman who had tried to erase me. You did not just steal my inheritance, you tried to steal my mind. You tried to convince me that my passion was madness, that my thoughts were worthless, that my very existence was an inconvenience. You tried to make me into a ghost, but you failed. I turned to my father. And you, I said, the tremor in my voice now one of righteous anger. You stood by and watched. You let her dim every light inside me because you were too weak to challenge her. You chose a quiet life over your own daughter. I pity you. Finally, I looked at Rosalind, who was staring at me with wide, shocked eyes, tears beginning to stream down her face. You were not cruel, I said, my voice softening slightly. You were just blind. You lived in the sun and never thought to look in the shadows. I hope now you will learn to see. A profound silence filled the room. Beatrice was ashen, defeated. My father could not meet my gaze. Rosalind took a hesitant step toward me, her hand outstretched. Elara, I never knew. Before she could reach me, Alistair moved. He came to my side, a solid, unwavering presence. He did not take my hand, but his proximity was a declaration. He was with me. He had stood for me. He had given me the ground on which I could finally stand for myself. I believe, the Duke said, his voice calm and final, that this conversation is over. My solicitor will be in contact. He dismissed them with a nod, turning his back on their ruin. They shuffled out of the room, a broken, defeated tableau. Rosalind was the last to leave, her tearful backward glance a silent apology that was years too late, but perhaps a beginning. When the heavy library doors closed, leaving us in blessed silence, the strength that had surged through me ebbed away, leaving me trembling. The enormity of what had just happened, of the words I had finally spoken, washed over me. I swayed, and Alistair's hand was instantly at my elbow, steadying me. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice stripped of its ducal authority, filled only with a deep personal concern. I could only nod, tears welling in my eyes. They were not tears of sadness or anger, but of a profound, earth-shattering catharsis. The ghost was gone. I was solid. I was real. He led me to the window seat, the one overlooking the wild, windswept moor. We sat in silence for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. He did not press me to speak. He simply sat with me, his presence a quiet comfort, a promise that I was no longer alone in the shadows. "Why?" I finally whispered, my voice hoarse. "Why did you do all of this? For me?" He turned to face me, his gray eyes serious and searching. "When I first saw you at the ball," he began, his voice a low murmur, "everyone else was looking at the spectacle. You were looking at the structure, at the truth of the room. I have spent 5 years surrounded by people who see only surfaces. You saw the bones, the design, the things that last." He paused, and a look of deep vulnerability crossed his face. "My brother Julian was like that. He saw the world that way. When I lost him, I thought I was the only one left who spoke that language." He reached out then, not to my elbow, but to my hand. His fingers were warm and strong, and they laced through my own as if they were always meant to be there. That first day, in this library, listening to you speak, it was like hearing a piece of my own soul spoken back to me. I did not do this for you, Elara. I did this for us. The word hung in the air between us. Us. It was a word I had never been a part of, a word that promised a future I had never dared to imagine. Beatrice was wrong about so many things, he continued, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. But she was right about one. I do have a design. I wish to restore the east wing of this house. It was Julian's dream, and now it is mine. But it is a project too large for one person. It requires two minds, a historian to honor the past and an architect to build the future. He met my gaze, his own unwavering. I am asking you, Elara, to be my partner in all things. It was not a flowery, poetic proposal. It was something far better. It was a proposal of partnership, of respect, of a shared life built on a foundation of mutual understanding. He was not rescuing me. He was inviting me to build something with him. Tears streamed down my face now, but I was smiling. Yes, I whispered. Yes, Alistair. In all things. He did not crush me in a passionate embrace. His movements were, as always, deliberate and meaningful. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. Then, with infinite care, he leaned in and captured my lips with his own. The kiss was not a spark, but a slow, deep warmth, the end of a very long winter. It was a promise of quiet mornings spent over blueprints, of shared silences in a library filled with books, of a life where I would never be invisible again. It was the feeling of coming home. Our wedding was to be a small, private affair at Blackwood Manor, a quiet ceremony for a quiet love. But Beatrice, even in her disgrace, had one last venomous dart to throw. Just as the vicar began to speak, the chapel doors burst open. A woman, beautiful and disheveled, her face a mask of theatrical despair, stormed down the aisle. "Alistair," she cried, her voice ringing with false anguish. "How could you? You promised me. You said you loved me. You cannot marry this nothing." A collective gasp went through the few assembled guests. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. My father, who was in attendance out of a lingering sense of duty, looked horrified. Rosalind, standing beside me as my maid of honor, reached for my hand, her grip fierce and protective. This was Beatrice's handiwork, a final, desperate attempt to create a scandal so profound it would shatter everything. All eyes flew to Alistair. He stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. The woman reached him, clutching at his arm, sobbing hysterically. "Tell them, Alistair, tell them of our nights together. You cannot cast me aside for this plain little mouse." I felt myself flinch at the words, the old poison trying to find a purchase. I braced myself for the chaos, the questions, the inevitable ruin of the day. But Alistair did not look at her. He did not engage. He simply, gently, detached her hand from his sleeve. Then, in an act that stunned the entire room into silence, he walked past the weeping actress. He walked past the scandal, the drama, the lie. He walked directly to me. He did not speak. He simply knelt before me, on the cold stone floor of the chapel. He took my hands in his head bowed in a gesture of such profound, unwavering devotion that it took my breath away. In that single silent movement he told me, and everyone present, everything they needed to know. He made his choice. He declared his allegiance. He showed them all that she was the phantom, and I was his reality. He stayed there for a long moment, kneeling at my feet, a duke paying homage not to a title or a fortune, but to me. Then he rose, his back still to the sputtering woman. He turned to face our guests. "Allow me to introduce you all to Miss Annalise," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the chapel. "She is a moderately talented actress from the Lyceum Theatre. A week ago she was hired by a desperate and disgraced woman, Beatrice Ashworth, for the sum of £200 to perform this very scene." He gestured to his man of business, who stepped forward with a ledger. "We have the receipts. We also have a signed confession from Miss Annalise's theatrical agent, who was appalled at being drawn into such a sordid affair." He finally turned his gaze on the woman, and it was like being caught in a winter storm. She visibly shrank. "Your performance is over," he said, his voice dropping to a lethally quiet register. "You may collect your remaining fee from my man outside. I would advise you to leave the county before nightfall." The actress, her face pale with shock and fear, gave a strangled sob and fled. The silence she left behind was absolute. Alistair then looked toward my father, his expression one of cold disappointment. "And you, Lord Ashworth, you will leave my house, now." My father, utterly shamed, turned and walked out of the chapel without a word, his final act of paternal failure complete. Alistair turned back to me, his gray eyes soft and filled with a fierce protective love. He gently squeezed my hands. "Now," he said, as if there had been no interruption at all. Where were we? The vicar, recovering from his shock, cleared his throat. I looked at Alistair, my heart so full it felt it might burst. He had not just defended me. He had anticipated the attack, disarmed it with quiet, irrefutable facts, and in doing so had shown everyone that his faith in me was unshakable. He had faced down the ugliest lie and knelt before the silent truth. Rosalind squeezed my hand one last time, her eyes shining with tears of relief and a newfound respect. "I see now," she whispered. "I finally see." As I said my vows, my voice was clear and strong. I was no longer a creature of the shadows, but a woman standing in the light, beside a man who had not rescued me from the darkness, but had simply walked into it, taken my hand, and shown me that the light had been inside me all along. 1 year later, the East Wing was no longer a ruin. It was a testament to our partnership. Sunlight streamed through newly glazed Palladian windows, illuminating the warm oak of the new library floor and the fresh plaster of the walls. It was a space reborn, a perfect marriage of historical integrity and modern innovation, of his vision and mine. I stood on a small balcony overlooking the gardens, a set of blueprints held loosely in my hand. The late afternoon sun warmed my face. A breeze carried the scent of rain-washed stone and blooming roses. I wore a simple dress of deep blue, the color of twilight, and on my finger, a simple gold band sat beside a ring set with a single clear gray diamond, the color of my husband's eyes. I heard his footsteps behind me and smiled without turning. I knew his tread as well as I knew my own heartbeat. His arms came around my waist and he rested his chin on my shoulder, his gaze following mine out over the grounds. "The cornices are perfect," I murmured, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "The masons captured the shadow gap exactly as we drew it." "I never doubted they would," he replied, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "You were very, specific in your instructions." I laughed, a sound that was still new and wonderful to me. "Someone has to be. You would have let them use the wrong grade of limestone." "I would have," he agreed without a hint of shame. "That is why I have you, my love, my brilliant, exacting, and very specific Duchess." He pressed a kiss to my temple. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change, two people perfectly at ease in a world they were building together. Rosalind had visited last week. After our wedding, she had broken away from our father's crumbling reputation, using her own small inheritance to establish a modest but independent life in the city. She was quieter now, more thoughtful. The brilliant shine had been replaced by a softer, more genuine glow. Our relationship was new, fragile, but it was real. We were finally becoming sisters. My father lived in self-imposed exile on a small rented estate, a shadow of the man he once was. I felt not anger toward him anymore, only a distant pity. Beatrice had vanished entirely, consumed by her debts and her disgrace, a ghost in her own right. "Do you ever miss it?" Alistair asked quietly, his voice pulling me from my reverie. "Miss what?" "The silence, the invisibility, the shadows." I considered his question. I thought of the girl in the gray dress pressed against a marble pillar, her heart aching with a silent secret language no one else understood. She felt like a character in a book I had read long ago. I was grateful for her resilience, for the inner world she had built to survive, but I did not miss her prison. "No," I said, turning in his arms to face him. I traced the faint scar above his eyebrow with my fingertip. "I have learned that silence is only beautiful when it is shared, and I would rather stand in the sun with you than hide in any shadow alone." The severe lines of his face softened into the rare, beautiful smile that was reserved only for me. "Good," he said, "because I have no intention of ever letting you go." He leaned down and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss filled with the quiet certainty of a love that was not built on grand passions or dramatic declarations, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of being truly, completely, and perfectly seen.